Before Europe feared his name, Napoleon Bonaparte was just a boy from a small island. He was not born in Paris. He was not born in a palace. He did not come from one of the ancient families that had ruled France for centuries. He was born on Corsica, an island of mountains, pride, poverty, and old loyalties. And when he first came into the world, France itself was still learning how to hold that island. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. And in time, that name would move armies, frighten kings, inspire soldiers, divide nations, and burn itself into the memory of Europe. He would rise from obscurity to command armies. He would become the master of France. He would crown himself emperor. He would win victories so brilliant that even his enemies studied them. He would redraw borders, break old dynasties, spread new laws, and carry the ideals of the French Revolution across the continent by force of arms. But his ambition would also bring endless war. Cities would tremble. Fields would fill with the dead. Families across Europe would lose sons to his campaigns. And the man who once seemed impossible to stop would end his life far from France, on a damp and lonely island in the South Atlantic. This is not the story of a simple hero. And it is not the story of a simple villain. It is a story of a man who carried both order and chaos. A man who built and destroyed. A man who rose faster than almost anyone in history and fell with the same terrible force. This is the story of Napoleon, the man who set Europe on fire. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio on the island of Corsica. His family belonged to the minor nobility, but they were not wealthy. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was ambitious and politically flexible. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was strong, disciplined, and deeply practical. Napoleon would later remember her as a woman of iron character. Corsica shaped him before France did. The island had its own language, its own memories, and its own wounds. Only shortly before Napoleon's birth, Corsica had come under French control. Many Corsicans still remember the fight for independence led by Pasquale Paoli. As a child, Napoleon grew up between two worlds. At home, he heard Italian and Corsican speech. At school, he would be expected to become French. This tension never truly left him. He wanted to belong. But he also wanted to rise above those who looked down on him. When Napoleon was 10 years old, he left Corsica for mainland France. He entered a military school at Brienne. The journey separated him from his island, his family, and the world he knew. At Brienne, he was not loved. He had a foreign accent. He was not rich. He was proud, serious, and often alone. Other boys mocked him. But loneliness can sharpen a person. Napoleon read deeply. He studied history. He admired great men of the ancient world. He was especially strong in mathematics, a useful skill for artillery. And while others dreamed of courtly life, Napoleon learned discipline, calculation, and endurance. He did not yet have power, but he had something almost as dangerous. He had resentment, and he had patience. In 1784, he moved to the École Militaire in Paris. 1 year later, after his father died, Napoleon had to finish his studies quickly. His family needed money. He became an artillery officer in the French army. At that moment, he was still a young man with no great future promised him. France was still ruled by a king. The old nobility still guarded power. A Corsican officer with a strange accent could not easily expect glory. But history was about to open a door. In 1789, the French Revolution began. What started as a crisis of debt hunger, and political anger became something much larger. The old order cracked. The king's authority weakened. Privileges were attacked. The language of liberty, nation, citizenship, and equality moved through France like a storm. For many, the revolution was terrifying. For Napoleon, it was opportunity. The revolution broke old barriers. It weakened the power of birth. It made room for talent, ambition, and violence. Napoleon did not create this new world, but he understood it. He understood that in a time of collapse, a young man could rise if he was useful, and he would make himself useful. His first great moment came at Toulon in 1793. Toulon was a French port city that had turned against the revolutionary government. British and Allied forces were involved in its defense. The situation was dangerous. France could not afford to lose such a port. Napoleon, still young, was given a chance to apply his artillery skills. He understood that the key to Toulon was not reckless courage. It was position. It was guns. It was controlling the harbor. His plan helped force the enemy fleet to withdraw. Toulon fell back into revolutionary hands. Napoleon was promoted. He had shown something that would mark his entire career. He could see the battlefield as a problem to be solved. He could find the weak point. He could move quickly. And he could use violence with precision. After Toulon, Napoleon's rise was not smooth. The revolution itself was unstable. Factions rose and fell. The reign of terror consumed enemies, rivals, and sometimes its own supporters. Napoleon was briefly imprisoned after the fall of Robespierre because of his connections to the wrong political circle. But he survived. And survival, in revolutionary France, was already an achievement. In 1795, Paris faced a royalist uprising. The government needed someone who would act decisively. Napoleon did. He used artillery against the insurgents. The uprising was crushed. It was a brutal moment, but it made him valuable. France had many politicians. It had many talkers. Napoleon was something different. He was a man who could restore order with cannon fire. Soon after, he received command of the army of Italy. He was only in his 20s. The army he inherited was poorly supplied, tired, and neglected. Its soldiers lacked food, shoes, and confidence. Many generals would have complained. Napoleon transformed them. He spoke to their hunger. He promised them glory. He promised them rich lands beyond the mountains. He gave them movement. And then he gave them victory. The Italian campaign of 1796 and 1797 made Napoleon famous. He fought the Austrians and their allies with speed and daring. He divided enemy forces before they could unite. He struck where he was not expected. At battles such as Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli, he turned a weak army into an instrument of conquest. France saw him not merely as a general, but as a hero. His soldiers began to believe in him. And Napoleon understood the power of belief. He wrote bulletins. He shaped his own image. He made himself appear larger than life. He was not only winning battles, he was creating the legend of Napoleon Bonaparte. In Italy, he also learned politics. He negotiated treaties. He reorganized territories. He dealt with republics, princes, artists, priests, and bankers. He saw how military victory could become political power. He saw that a general who won enough battles could become more important than the government that sent him. This was dangerous knowledge. And Napoleon did not forget it. By the time he returned from Italy, he was no longer just an officer of the Republic. He was a national figure. But France remained unstable. The government, known as a Directory, was weak and unpopular. War continued. The economy struggled. Political enemies waited everywhere. Napoleon needed another stage. He found it in Egypt. In 1798, he led an expedition to Egypt. The plan was partly military and partly political. France hoped to threaten British interests by striking toward the eastern Mediterranean and the route to India. Napoleon also brought scholars, scientists, engineers, and artists. He wanted conquest, but he also wanted glory. Egypt offered ancient monuments, mystery, and the promise of a new kind of fame. At the Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798, Napoleon defeated the Mamluk forces near Cairo. The victory was impressive, but the campaign soon turned against him. British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon's army was stranded. The French occupation faced resistance. Disease, heat, distance, and failed campaigns weakened the expedition. Napoleon still won battles on land, but the larger project was failing. And when he learned that France was in political crisis again, he made a decision that revealed his true priorities. He left Egypt. He returned to France. Some would call it abandonment. Others would call it calculation. Napoleon called it destiny. In 1799, France was exhausted. The Directory had lost authority. The revolution had promised liberty and stability, but many French citizens had seen terror, inflation, corruption, and war. The country wanted order. Napoleon offered it. On November 9, 1799, the coup of 18 Brumaire began. The old government was pushed aside. The process was confused, tense, and not as clean as later legend would suggest. Napoleon was not always calm. He faced resistance. There was shouting, pressure, and military force. But by the end, a new system was born. The consulate. And Napoleon became first consul. In theory, France still had republican forms. In reality, power moved toward one man. Napoleon understood something that many revolutionaries had not. People can become tired of chaos. They may accept authority if it brings stability. And Napoleon gave France stability. He worked with extraordinary energy. He reformed administration. He strengthened the state. He created the Bank of France. He supported a more organized education system. He established the Legion of Honor. And most importantly, he oversaw the Civil Code, later known as the Napoleonic Code. The code did not make everyone equal in the modern sense. It preserved strong authority within the family and society. But it did protect important revolutionary principles. Equality before the law. Protection of property. Careers open to talent. A legal order clearer than the patchwork of the old regime. This was one of Napoleon's lasting achievements. Armies would march away. Borders would change again. But laws and institutions would remain. Still, Napoleon was not satisfied with being first consul. Power, once tasted, rarely teaches restraint. In 1804, he became Emperor of the French. The ceremony took place in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Pope Pius VII was present. Napoleon wore the symbols of monarchy, but he claimed to represent the nation and the revolution. He wanted to be more than a king. He wanted to be the founder of a dynasty. The image was carefully staged. A man born on Corsica, once mocked for his accent, now stood at the center of France. He had crossed from outsider to ruler, from artillery officer to emperor. But crowns do not end danger. They attract it. Europe's monarchies watched Napoleon with fear and hatred. To them, he was a child of revolution, a soldier who had seized a throne, a threat to every old dynasty. War returned. In 1805, Napoleon faced a third coalition. Britain, Austria, Russia, and others opposed him. At sea, France suffered a decisive blow at Trafalgar, where the British fleet under Nelson defeated the combined French and Spanish fleet. Napoleon would never invade Britain, but on land, he remained terrifying. In December 1805, he won one of his greatest victories at Austerlitz. The battle became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Napoleon faced Austrian and Russian forces. He used deception, timing, and terrain. He made his enemies believe his center was weak. Then he struck. Austerlitz was not just a victory. It was a masterpiece. The Holy Roman Empire, an ancient structure in European history, would soon come to an end. Napoleon's influence spread across the continent. Kings fell. New states were created. Relatives and loyalists were placed on thrones. The map of Europe began to change according to his will. For his admirers, Napoleon brought modern law, efficient administration, and the end of feudal remains. For his enemies, he brought occupation, censorship, taxes, conscription, and humiliation. Both views contain truth. This is what makes Napoleon difficult. He was not only a destroyer, and he was not only a reformer. He was both. In 1806, Prussia challenged him and was crushed at Jena and Auerstedt. In 1807, after the hard fighting against Russia and Prussia, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander I at Tilsit. For a moment, it seemed as if Napoleon could arrange Europe around himself. He was at the height of his power. But the seeds of decline were already growing, because Napoleon's empire depended on constant pressure, constant victory, constant obedience. And Europe was too large, too proud, and too wounded to remain obedient forever. One of Napoleon's greatest problems was Britain. Britain could not easily defeat him on land, but Britain ruled the seas. Its navy protected its trade. Its money helped finance coalitions. Napoleon tried to defeat Britain through economics. He created the Continental System, an attempt to block British goods from European markets. But this system hurt many economies. It encouraged smuggling. It created resentment. And to enforce it, Napoleon had to interfere in more and more places. One of those places was Spain. In 1808, Napoleon placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. It was a disastrous decision. The Spanish people resisted fiercely. A brutal guerrilla war began. British forces under Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, entered the struggle in the Iberian Peninsula. The war drained French resources. It damaged Napoleon's image. It showed that a people fighting for religion, king, country, and local freedom could resist even the greatest army in Europe. Spain became a wound that would not heal. At home, Napoleon also faced a personal problem. He needed an heir. His marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais had been politically and emotionally important, but they had no child together. Napoleon divorced her. In 1810, he married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian emperor. The marriage linked him to one of Europe's oldest dynasties. In 1811, a son was born. Napoleon had an heir. For a moment, His dynasty seemed secure. But history was already turning against him. The greatest disaster came from Russia. Relations between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I deteriorated. The continental system, Polish questions, economic pressure, and distrust all pushed the two empires apart. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. He gathered a vast army, drawn not only from France, but from many parts of his empire and allied states. It was one of the largest forces Europe had ever seen. But Russia was not like Italy or Austria. It was immense. Its distances swallowed armies. Its roads were poor. Its climate was unforgiving. The Russians refused to give Napoleon the decisive political victory he wanted. They retreated. They burned supplies. They drew him deeper. At Borodino in September 1812, the armies fought a terrible battle. Napoleon won the field, but not the war. The Russian army survived. Napoleon reached Moscow. But Moscow did not give him peace. The city was largely abandoned. Fires broke out. Tsar Alexander did not surrender. Napoleon waited. Every day made his position worse. Winter approached. Supplies failed. The army that had marched east in confidence now had to retreat through hunger, cold, mud, snow, and attacks. The retreat from Russia became a catastrophe. Men froze. Horses died. Discipline collapsed. The crossing of the Berezina River became a symbol of desperation. Napoleon escaped. But the myth of invincibility did not. Europe saw that he could be beaten. Prussia rose. Austria turned against him. Russia advanced. Britain continued the war. The fire of Napoleon had spread across Europe, now began to close around France. In 1813, Napoleon fought on. He was still brilliant. He could still win battles. But he no longer had the same army. Too many veterans were gone. Too many horses had died. Too many enemies were united against him. At Leipzig, in the Battle of Nations, Napoleon suffered a major defeat. The coalition pushed west. In 1814, war came into France itself. Napoleon fought a desperate campaign with skill and energy. But skill could not change the balance forever. Paris fell. His marshals and politicians lost faith. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba, near the coast of Italy. For most men, this would have been the end. But Napoleon was not most men. Elba was too close, too small, too open to memory. He still watched France. He heard that the restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, was unpopular with many. He knew soldiers still remembered him. He knew the legend was alive. In 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba. He landed in France. The king sent troops to stop him, but the soldiers did not fire. Many joined him. The march to Paris became one of the most dramatic returns in history. Without a major battle, Napoleon regained power. Louis XVIII fled. The emperor was back. This period became known as the 100 Days. But Europe would not accept him. The powers that had defeated him before declared him an outlaw and prepared for war. Napoleon had one final chance. He moved quickly into Belgium, hoping to defeat the Allied armies before they could unite. Against him stood Wellington's multinational army and the Prussian army under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. On June 18, 1815, near Waterloo, Napoleon fought his last great battle. The field was wet from rain. The French attacks came again and again. Wellington's army held its ground. The Prussians arrived. By evening, Napoleon's army was broken. Waterloo ended him. Not because Napoleon had suddenly become ordinary, but because Europe had learned. His enemies had endured. His army was no longer the army of Austerlitz. And the man who had once used time as a weapon now ran out of it. After Waterloo, Napoleon returned to Paris. On June 22nd, 1815, he abdicated for the second time. He hoped, briefly, to escape to the United States. But British ships blocked the way. He surrendered to the British. This time, his captors would not make the mistake of sending him somewhere close. They sent him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, far from France, far from Europe, far from any army that might bring him back. Napoleon arrived there in October 1815. He lived at Longwood House, a damp and uncomfortable residence. He was watched closely. His letters were controlled. His movements were restricted. The man who had once commanded the movement of hundreds of thousands of soldiers now lived under the supervision of guards. His world shrank. From Europe to an island. From palaces to Longwood. From commands to memories. On St. Helena, Napoleon dictated his memoirs. He spoke of his campaigns. He defended his decisions. He shaped the story he wanted future generations to remember. In defeat, he fought one last battle. A battle over memory. And in many ways, he won part of it. Because the Napoleon of legend did not die at Waterloo. It grew on St. Helena. The lonely emperor. The betrayed genius. The man of destiny. The modern Caesar. The monster, the reformer, the tyrant, the soldier of the revolution, the enemy of Europe. Each generation would choose its own Napoleon. His health declined. On May 5th, 1821, Napoleon died on St. Helena. He was 51 years old. The cause of death has long been discussed. But stomach cancer is widely accepted by many historians as the most likely explanation. He died far from the country he had ruled, but not forgotten. In 1840, his remains were returned to France. Crowds gathered. The legend had only grown. Today, Napoleon rests at Les Invalides in Paris. A grand tomb for a man whose life was anything but small. So, what did Napoleon leave behind? He left laws. He left institutions. He left administrative reforms. He left the Napoleonic Code, which influenced legal systems beyond France. He left the idea that talent could rise faster than birth. He left the image of the modern military leader, moving nations like pieces on a map. But he also left graves. He left devastated families. He left occupied countries. He left a Europe exhausted by war. He spread some principles of the French Revolution, but often through conquest. He attacked old privileges, but crowned himself emperor. He spoke of merit, but placed his relatives on thrones. He gave order to France, but demanded obedience from Europe. That is the contradiction of Napoleon. He was a son of the Revolution, who became an emperor, a maker of law who lived by war, a genius of organization who could not organize peace, a man who rose because the old world was collapsing and then tried to build a new world around himself. For a time, it seemed possible. For a time, he stood at the center of Europe. Kings feared him. Soldiers followed him. Enemies studied him. Nations rose against him. And then, like so many men who believe they can command history, he discovered that history cannot be commanded forever. Napoleon set Europe on fire. But fire does not only destroy what it touches, it also reveals the shape of what remains. After Napoleon, Europe was not the same. France was not the same. War was not the same. The state was not the same. The memory of power was not the same. And the boy from Corsica, who once stood lonely in a French schoolyard, became one of the most studied, admired, hated, and debated figures in human history. His life asks a question that has never fully gone away. How much greatness can the world accept before it becomes destruction? And how much destruction can be forgiven because it wore the face of greatness? Napoleon Bonaparte never found peace in life. Perhaps he was not made for peace. He was made for movement, for command, for crisis, for the sound of marching feet and the glow of distant fires. But in the end, there were no more armies, no more battles, no more capitals to enter. Only the wind over St. Helena, only the sea, only memory. And memory, in the end, became his last empire.